fantastic to see so many of you here, and welcome all of you to the first of our spring series of inaugural lectures. My name is Mark Hallett, and I'm the Merit Liaison Director here at the Professorial. This unusually rich and extended series of inaugural lectures, 5 in all, and running right through till March, promises to be a treat. It gives us a chance to properly celebrate 5 members of our Professorial, reflect on their achievements, to hear about their latest research. It also gives us the chance to appreciate, to revel in, the richness and the variety of the scholarship being generated by the senior academic members of the Courtauld community. Over the coming weeks, you'll have the chance to enjoy the inaugural lectures of my colleagues Professor Suzanne Barbailly on the 13th of February, Professor Martin Cager-Smith on the 5th of March, Professor Dorothy Price on the 19th of March, and last but certainly not least, Professor Alex Bovey on the 26th of March. So please book your places. They're becoming the hottest tickets in town. And here I want to pass on my thanks to our Dean of Research, Lucy Bradnott, for putting this great series together, working with the wonderful members of our Research Forum team, led by Leah Lebamba. But tonight I'm delighted to be helping to introduce my colleague, Professor Joe Applin, the Walter H. Annenberg Professor of Art at the Courtauld. You'll be hearing a lot more about Joe's remarkable scholarly and curatorial achievements in a moment. But I just wanted to say that as well as being an absolutely brilliant art historian, she's also a wonderfully warm, astute, and generous colleague. I know this not only from working with her for the last 8 or so months here at the Courtauld, but also from working with her for so many years, or many years, at the University of York. Those as members of the department at York are here tonight, and that's a testament, I think, to the affection which Joe has helped. How can you be so brilliant and yet so down to earth, all at the same time? So prolific and yet so unhurried. So focused and yet so kind. We wondered then, and we wonder still. For all these reasons, it is a particular pleasure for me to see us kicking off this series with Joe. I can't wait to hear her lecture tonight and to raise a glass to her afterwards. Before all of that, I'd like now to turn to Professor Brian Fair, Professor of History of Art at UCL, and someone who knows and appreciates Jo and her work better than almost, well, Richard's here, better than almost anyone else. And we'll now say a few words of further introduction. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Well, we're here to celebrate Jo, Walter H. Annenberg Professor, and I'm incredibly honoured to be introducing her to you tonight on the occasion of her inaugural lecture. And the sheer number of people here at this sold-out event, ages ago, I think, good job you booked early, is testament to everything I think I'm about to say about Jo, both as an art historian who's inspired so many of us, and as a much-loved and generous teacher, colleague, writer, and friend. There are so many different sides to Jo, it's hard to do justice to her stellar academic career in less than 10 minutes. Beginning as a lecturer at the University of York in 2004. She joined the Courtauld in 2013 and was promoted to professor in 2020. We've been waiting a while for this evening. She has throughout made an enormous contribution to the department, the institution, wherever she's been. Her sense of justice, as well as her commitment, has meant she's taken on positions of great responsibility, and she's always made things better in often challenging times. I've observed this and wondered over many years, and many of you in this room will of course have first-hand experience of what that actually means to everybody's lives, both students and faculty. In unpropitious times, I think Jo stands for the values that we need to hold on to, both in terms of her amazing collegiality, and also the imaginative power of her thinking. So clear in her teaching, and especially, of course, in all her writing, all her published work, that has simply transformed the way we understand modern American art, especially the complex legacies of the 1960s. And it's this that I want to comment on in particular, Jo's work as a scholar, as someone preeminent in her field. She has been, as Mark says, prolific, producing several important books, as well as a myriad of essays, articles, and criticism that show her impressive range. In fact, looking at her CV that I kind of thought I knew, but obviously didn't quite, there are 2 years, 2012 and 2018, where she has 2 books come out in each of those years. How can that be? It's very impressive. I guess it owes more to publishing schedules, perhaps, than it does to her meticulous approach to working. And I hope it's not too presumptuous to assume that I know what it's like when I say how much I admire her ability to maintain her writing so consistently at the level that she has, and in spite of all the responsibilities that she has taken on. That sense of herself as a writer that she fought for early on, and which was already amply demonstrated in that first book on the 60s called Eccentric Objects, published in 2012 by Yale University Press, which genuinely reconfigured, I think, the way we think about 60s American art, turning our attention to little known artists like H.C. Westerman, Lucas Samaras, you know, these artists who'd previously been seen as quirky or trivial, certainly second rung on the ladder of artistic worth, overshadowed by all the Judds and the Naumans, and even by all the Eva Hessers and all the Louise Bourgeois, for that matter. That eye, Jo's eye, was there to stay, I think it's fair to say, and what an eye it is. She's attuned to the visual, not just the quirky, but the strange, the relatively uncharted, or the strange in the familiar. I actually think there's something very militant in Jo's eye that takes in and registers something about the unruly aspects of art. She's always had it, and it militates against the orthodoxies of the discipline to transform what we think we know. For me, I guess that's about as good as it gets, and it's a rare, rare gift that comes up behind you, takes you by surprise over and over again when you read her work and when you hear her talk. In the incredibly crowded field that is the history of modern and contemporary art, she has always knocked it sideways in what I'm calling her relentless, and I mean that in a good way, commitment to the work of women artists, and especially the unruly aspects of it. And in her work on British artist Alison Wilding, that sense of commitment to the work and brilliantly subtle sense of it, of the subversive strategies of her sculpture, is one of the just many examples I could cite, but one closest to my heart. Nowhere is her taste for the wrecking ball that is painting and its radically turbulent effects more dramatically seen than in her extraordinary book on Lee Lozano, Not Working, 2018. All the more so because of her occasionally deadpan, occasionally tongue-in-cheek, often ironic tone. Jo really knows about tone. She knows that to understate is the only way to get to the absurdly inflated logic of Lozano's painterly protestations. The fact that the book was awarded a prize by the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C., and was shortlisted for others and very enthusiastically reviewed, was of course amply deserved. There are other prizes, other appointments, editorships, other markers of her eminence in the field, too many to mention here. Never one to revel in her own glory. Most of them show how active and assiduous she is in giving other scholars the chance to develop their research, not least, of course, in her involvement as one of the editors of the important publication and platform for groundbreaking research, that is the Oxford Art Journal. What stands out as constant in all of this, her career path, her trajectory as a scholar, the appointments, the visiting appointments that she has held, in everything that she's achieved, is that it's always burned bright, I think, with a sense of critical urgency, one that's authentically her own, that's original, genuinely original, as it is because it is her own, and it matters. There can be a great deal at stake in what's being seen as a quirky backwater, or in trying to get your head around what sculpture's doing, or in what's going on in a pile of paint next to an obscene expletive in a Lee Lozano painting. Her next project on aging promises to have that same sense of an ethics, of seeking out and charting artistic, psychic, and political impulses, figuring out connections between art and lived experiences that matter to us in profound ways. I think it's often underestimated how important it is to be a good writer as well as a good art historian. And Jo shows us why it's important, and her clarity and lucidity of language is a great model to us all. She shows that you can be critically and theoretically astute while also writing closely with a sustained attention about the art objects and artworks that are your prime object. I've always held to that, and Jo, I think, has become the best exponent of it, and in my view, one of the most compelling writers on art of her generation. Her recent writing in the LRB is a recognition of that fact. I said writer, but I also mean speaker, of course, and I won't take up any more time that we could be spending hearing Jo talk. So, Jo, thank you for the work that you've done, for the person that you are, for all the remarkable work that you're going on to and will continue to bring into the world. So let's listen to Jo talking about aging badly, an irresistible title that is exactly what you would expect of Jo, of course. I'm sure there's mischief ahead. I feel that there's mischief ahead, and I can't wait to hear it. Thank you, Jo.
Thank you, Bryony. Thank you. That was lovely. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you all for being here. I'm so touched to see you all here. I'm grateful. I'm also a bit overwhelmed, so let's just start. You or me? The title is both a statement and a threat. One gun directed at you, the other at the me of the work's title, the 85-year-old artist Maria Lasnig. It's a painting that defies the genre of late-life self-portraiture in notable ways. It's neither elegiac, nor stately, pathetic, nor proud. In fact, I feel a bit awkward when faced with it. Maybe you do too. That wild, panicked stare and skull-like head, the slightly dropped jaw and the full frontal naked stance, drooping breasts and legs splayed across the lower part of the canvas. There is the barest promise of a background, alluded to by the turquoise spectre haloing the torso. But of course, we don't need it, that background, because the image stops us dead in our tracks regardless. You or Me is one of Lassenig's self-described drastic paintings, which she began in her 80s, combining, she said, exaggeration with pure realism, a little embellished and uglified. It is, I think, too, an image of ageing, a self-portrait of the artist as an older woman, nothing to lose, or perhaps it's already been lost. You or Me is a ridiculous, humane painting, drenched in a kind of absurdity it's hard to put your finger on. I'm a little embarrassed looking at Lassenig's painting. It's so frank, so, funny? Age itself is a funny one. No one likes to talk about it. People hide their age and lie about how old they are, although there are those survivors and winners who proudly declare their age, wearing it as a badge of honour. In addition, each generation has its own complicated attitudes to ageing, shaped and knotted up with social, cultural and economic factors that only really come into view years later. Ageing is also, need I say it, deeply relative, and who or what counts as old changes dramatically depending on one's perspective. Looking back now to my particular field of study, the 60s, what once seemed pretty clear-cut, that this was a decade marked by youthful revolution, doesn't quite hold up now as it once did, because of course it isn't only people or bodies that age or age badly, so too do ideas, epochs and objects. And I'm interested lately in how the 60s, Christopher Bolus's generational object par excellence, is itself a pretty old and tired, somewhat geriatric idea at this point. All that revolutionary fervour and utopianism hasn't aged as well as it might. And it's this thought that's been guiding and shaping this new project on art and ageing. I've called my lecture tonight Aging Badly. My choice of wording is deliberate and meant to serve as a counter to those who promote the idea that the goal of life is to age well or successfully. It was an idea that took hold with urgency, particularly in America during the 1960s, promoted by the state, activists, and medical professionals alike. Aging badly, by contrast, conjures a rather different image to aging well, although one it's all too easy to romanticise as somehow preferable or brave. Choices relating to how we age, real choice rooted in a freedom to, rather than a freedom from, as philosophers put it, often comes at a cost when it comes at all. Eva Hesse wryly accepted that the latex sculptures she made in the 1960s would age and perish, drying into darkened wrinkles, its skin-like surface rapidly losing elasticity over time. Life doesn't last, art doesn't last, Hesse said. Physical longevity was on her mind, and Hesse was reflecting as much on her own situation as the future state of her latex sculpture. In 1970, she died from the cancer that was already at an advanced stage when she made this comment, aged 34. As Hesse rightly insisted, art and work and art and life are very connected. Youth, Lassenig wrote, equals letting things happen, letting oneself drift and be carried away. In You or Me, youthful laissez-faire is replaced by out-and-out refusal. Old age should burn and rave at close of day, wrote Dylan Thomas. Rage against the dying of the light. So Thomas was only in his 30s when he wrote these lines, ostensibly about the death of his father, although Thomas himself would die from alcoholism while staying at the Chelsea Hotel in New York 2 years later in 1953. But of course, death is not synonymous with old age, and while we may moan, rave, or otherwise dread, or for some welcome, the ageing process, we do well to remember that not everyone has the privilege of growing old, of ageing, whether well, successfully, or badly. And for that reason, I'd like to dedicate my inaugural lecture tonight to the memory of my funny, fierce twin, Sister Lisa. She didn't care about art or ageing and was all the better for it. But she was my biggest cheerleader and so proud when she learned I'd become a professor. We didn't get to grow old together, badly or otherwise. Here we are, aged 18. 18. God. And her loss has changed radically my thinking about the question of ageing in ways that I'm only just starting to work out, and tonight's talk is an early attempt at doing that. The 1960s has long functioned in the popular imagination as a decade defined by youthful promise and revolution, as well as contempt for older generations whose old road was, in the words of Bob Dylan, rapidly ageing, and for whom 64 was alarmingly considered the pinnacle of old age. From the free speech movement's rallying cry, "Don't trust anyone over 30, to the Who's famous refrain, "Hope I die before I get old," getting older was anathema to the 20-something young men dominating the cultural landscape. But, of course, there's always someone thinking otherwise, who sees things differently. Here's the Beach Boys in 1966. Wouldn't it be nice if we were older? Then we wouldn't have to wait so long. So that, of course, is a song about the impatience of youth, but it's also a perversely odd way of thinking ageing's temporality. So let's keep the Beach Boys in mind. I'm opening with these familiar, too familiar perhaps, popular responses to old age, because I want to flag up immediately the problem of writing about the subject at all. It's cliché-ridden territory in which we each have a stake, a point of view, a hot take, even a remedy. Tell people you're working on ageing and art, and they often become very animated. Some express their surprise, sometimes distaste, even anger at the subject. Interest often starts to fade when people discover how you're going about doing it. Their examples are almost never mine, and I bet they won't be yours either. For art historians, a quick flick through one's mental Rolodex of self-portraits often ensues, Rembrandt or Louise Bourgeois, and why not? Most age studies books open with an autobiographical anecdote to explain why the author is writing about the subject at all. Art and work and art and life are very connected indeed. For others, the topic is simply depressing, embarrassing, a bit inappropriate, a bit like that Lasnik painting I opened with. As Joan Didion wrote in her 70s, ageing and its evidence remain life's most predictable events, yet they also remain matters we prefer to leave unmentioned, unexplored. Even psychoanalysis has largely failed us in this regard. Freud thought women after the age of 50 unanalysable. Their egos thicken and dry out over time, like a latex sculpture, and he uses a sculptural metaphor. He's talking about plaster, in fact. Later analysts, such as Pearl King, did much to successfully challenge this pervasive, exclusively male view. But then perhaps these various responses to the theme of ageing shouldn't be dismissed simply because they don't tell us what we want to hear. Perhaps rather they speak volumes about the ways in which ageing eludes us, theoretically and literally. Perhaps we can only really look or come at ageing askance. Toward the end of Virginia Woolf's final novel, The Years, Eleanor Partager wonders how, when looking back, she might make sense of her life, asking, oughtn't a life to be something you could handle and produce? She doesn't come up with an answer, but the question is one those invested in life writing have been asking ever since. As art historians, we are rightly suspicious of biography as an explanatory force. But the field of age studies makes a singular contribution, refusing to take either the life or version of ageing that narrative offers at face value. And by refusing to take ageing at face value as a mere fact of life or chronologically predetermined process, they reveal instead that the question or problem of ageing is one in need of interrogating, not taking as read. As the older Eleanor Partager concedes toward the end of the novel, old age, they say, is like this, but it isn't. It's different, quite different. Art historical writing is infused with a vocabulary of ageing, with questions of temporality and duration, about time, gender and the body, although it's not usually named as such. So too have terms such as juvenilia, maturity, the retrospective exhibition, and late style, whether as catastrophe or pinnacle, long served as the familiar markers of an artistic career, with retrospectives often only afforded women artists late in life or posthumously. "It's too late," as Carol Rama exclaimed upon being awarded the Lion d'Or at Venice in 2003, aged 84, brilliantly ungrateful for such late recognition of her life's work. And here she is applauding the jury for finally getting it right. Another self-portrait by the American artist Alice Neel, aged 80 years old, traffics in a similarly embellished form of pure realism to Lasnig's You or Me. Although Neel sports a cloth and paintbrush and Lasnig 2 guns, both women clearly mean business. Neel's self-portrait tends to be framed as a proud and defiant image of old age, a representation of an older woman comfortable in her skin and station in life. But I think it's condescending at best to project a sense of bravery or honesty onto a portrait simply because the sitter is old and naked. At worst, it betrays an unconsciously and deeply held aversion to getting old, turning the sitter into someone having triumphed over the adversity of age to emerge victorious the other side. I'm suspicious of that brand of feminism automatically celebrating such images of older women, in which youth and beauty remain the unspoken standard, with anyone daring to transgress either, or get older, in other words, immediately set apart as exceptional and praiseworthy, or that somehow this kind of imaging of old age is more honest or gets closer to the truth of the matter than others. In an article titled The Aching Body, Yvonne Rayner described how, aged 75, she reperformed her 1966 dance Trio A as Trio A, geriatric with talking. As she worked through the steps, Rayner narrated her movements out loud, saying, "I can no longer do this in a smooth fashion, and as long as I keep moving and don't stop." Rayner called this the let it hang out method. Audiences, she said, laughed. 10 years earlier, Rayner's film Privilege tackled ageing, focused this time on the psychological rather than physical. Privilege is a film about lots of things, including ageing, racism and the menopause. It plays with autobiography and the misremembering of one's life from the perspective of now. Privilege has 2 chief narrative arcs, the second of which comprises interviews with women talking about their lives and about the menopause. If for Neel, old age was, in her words, a deliverance, for a younger generation of middle-aged women, including the feminist artist Faith Ringgold, who is one of Rayner's few, possibly only artist interviewees, getting older was simply a bitch. And here she is, she's laughing, but she means it. Somewhat surprisingly, given the cultural and social emphasis on youth, during the 60s, the field of gerontology emerged in America as a dynamic and progressive area of research. New theoretical insights and terminology gained traction. In 1963, Robert Butler invented the life review, a clinical process whereby the older person is encouraged to make sense of their lives by looking back and giving it narrative structure through writing their life stories, or more commonly via oral history. Talking, rambling and repetition are to be expected, he warns. It was also Butler who coined the term ageism in the 60s as another rising form of bigotry, along with sexism and racism in American life. Of course, ageing and who gets to grow old is intimately tied to our experience of class, race and gender. Butler's work did much to popularise the idea of ageing well or successfully, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for his book Why Survive? Being Old in America. Butler's work was subsequently criticised by those radical gerontologists who rejected his liberal outlook and specifically his insistence that the solution to ageing well lay at the feet of the individual. For radical gerontology, the ageing population had become a highly profitable industry, particularly in the US. with the rise in healthcare plans, insurance, retirement villages, and the encouragement to look after yourself physically and economically. While the term radical gerontology unfortunately did not catch on, the insistence that we rethink ageing as a collective structural issue and as part of a broader politics of equality provided a powerful counter to the 60s liberal tendencies exemplified in the work of Butler, who, by focusing on sickness and poverty, assumed the elderly to be a dependent, relatively helpless cohort for whom ageing successfully required state-funded support services and a certain amount of self-willed gumption. Another notable contributor to early research into ageing was Dr. Alex Comfort, best known now as author of The Joy of Sex. As well as being a conscientious objector, anarchist, pacifist, and sexologist, Comfort was also a radical gerontologist, and he published a number of books on the topic from the early 1960s onwards. This included an illustrated guidebook aimed at the public, A Good Age, which followed the same format as The Joy of Sex, although with notably less exciting drawings, I warn you. Comfort was accused by conservative critics, Mary Whitehouse included, of contributing to the softening of moral fibre occasioned by the youth revolution of the 1960s. I've been wondering what happens when we think about softness, and particularly soft sculpture and its role within the history of art through a language of ageing. When we think of Klaus Oldenburg's iconic soft burger and toothpaste tube, not as radical and new, but aged forms that yield not just to touch, but the vicissitudes of time. And here are some soft sculptures of old people by the American artist and ex-Courtauld student Jan Hayworth, which she made in London during the 60s when the moral panic about the so-called cult of softness was at its height. Hayworth pushes the question of age front and centre. A member of Robert Groovy Bob Fraser's stable of artists, Hayworth's Old Lady 1 appeared on the cover of Sgt. Pepper in 1967, which she co-designed with her then husband, Peter Blake. Old Age Here, hidden in plain sight. Another portrait by Neil, of the pop artist Andy Warhol, painted when Neil was 70. Smartly dressed from the waist down in brown slacks and lace-up Oxfords, the shirtless Warhol reveals the flesh-toned surgical corset supporting his stomach muscles that had been ravaged when he was shot and nearly killed 2 years earlier on June 3rd, 1968. The attack was by Valerie Solanas, author of the infamous Scum Manifesto, which stood for the Society for Cutting Up Men. Unusually for a Neil portrait, Warhol kept his eyes closed, easier perhaps to lay bare the extent of the damage to his post-shooting body. Unlike the black and white photographs Richard Avedon took, which transformed Warhol's scarred and damaged body into a youthful, macho and queerly erotic abstraction, Neil painted a shyer Warhol, self-conscious about his appearance. Warhol was certainly feeling every one of his 42 years at the time he sat for his portrait with Neil, having survived childhood illness, eating disorders, and that recent near-fatal assassination attempt. On the day of her attack on Warhol, Solanas picked up her gun from the apartment of the 63-year-old artist May Wilson. I want to spend a bit of time now in Wilson's company. Here she is, taking part in a stilt competition in Central Park. She's sporting one of her handmade masks and necklaces. She had an idea to reinvent herself as a, quote, Edith Sitwell type of the art world. Wilson and Solanas were on friendly terms, having both lived for a time in the Chelsea Hotel in the summer of 1966. Solanas was one of a group of younger people drawn to Wilson's cluttered room, where the older artist would sometimes feed Solanas and lend her the occasional dollar and friendly ear. In the days prior to the shooting, Solanas had asked Wilson to look after her laundry, handing over a floral bag containing the gun that Wilson stored under her sofa bed. Wilson would show it off to visitors, dramatically pressing the bag close to her body to reveal the gun's outline and gasping, "This is Valerie's laundry." Wilson never spoke about her small, pivotal role in the shooting of Warhol. Her diary that day recorded only the bare facts of the situation, with no mention of having harboured the gun. I note this fact because for Wilson, June 3rd, 1968, was a significant date for entirely other reasons. It marked the 2-year anniversary of Wilson's arrival in New York, precipitated by the sudden breakdown of her 40-year-long marriage. "Hold on to your hat," she wrote to a friend. "Bill and I are separated as man and wife. He is 62 years old and is in love with a 45-year-old woman." It was, Wilson supposed, a classic case of 60-ish man trying to recapture feelings of youth before death. Wilson promptly left her family home in Maryland and pitched up, suitcase in hand, on the doorstep of her son William Wilson, the art critic and sometime member of Warhol's circle. She later complained that instead of letting her move in with his family, her son grabbed his coat and promptly marched her down the street, where she was dumped in the Chelsea Hotel a few blocks away. In the space of a few hours, Wilson underwent a radical transformation, from self-described country housewife and grandmother to reluctantly living at the heart of the city's counterculture. "What happened to me wouldn't happen to an old horse," she said. Wilson recorded sexist encounters and aborted romantic entanglements in her early weeks in the city with older male artists and doctors alike. She described one neighbour at the Chelsea as a short, fat man who calls me dear and squeezes my arm. Despite the weather, she refuses his offer of an air conditioner, as "I cannot be under obligation." She recounts other tales too of unwelcome advances and tongues shoved down her throat, each of which left her in equal parts shaken and angry, but also surprised at the sexual attention she found herself receiving as an older woman alone in the city. Although upset at the circumstances under which she'd ended up in New York, Wilson didn't miss her previous life. She'd always felt out of place in Maryland. She said, "I was the only one out of step there, a kook, and I was criticised because I could not adhere to their middle-class standards. I had gone too far off in the direction of the intellect and art." Since taking a series of correspondence courses in art and art history in the 40s, Wilson had established herself on the local art scene with her paintings, faux, naive renderings of familiar local spots, and somewhat surprisingly a group of clown portraits. I'm showing you here her first and one of her final in that series. Wilson soon, fortunately, moved into 3 dimensions, first with a group of fabric relief pieces with sheets of coloured fabric glued into raggedy folds. These aberrant abstractions were a world apart from those of her New York school contemporaries. While the assemblage sculpture she soon began to hammer, nail and glue together from junk gifted her by friends were of a piece with the work of a younger generation of artists. Wilson, always quick to make fun of herself, would sign letters Greta Garbage. The comparisons with Louise Nevelson were both obvious to critics and for Wilson unwelcome. These pieces, free-standing or mounted in open-fronted found boxes and upturned drawers, included a random hodgepodge of items: high-heeled shoes, muffin trays, cotton wheels, gloves, saucepans, golf balls, and so on. Freewheeling domestic psychodramas, the assemblages also often incorporated bits of dolls jammed together and bound into what she called her mummies. While Wilson's arrival in New York then was not the start of her career making art, it was certainly the making of Wilson as an artist. Though not a particularly successful one, she failed to secure gallery representation in the city and had at best some sporadic critical success in group shows. Instead, Wilson found a community of artists that included Ray Johnson, Dorothy Podber, and the painter, assemblage artist, critic, and cabaret performer Little Pickard. Pickard, who had already lived a life as a fringe member of the Berlin Dada scene, was significantly older than Wilson and claimed in 1960, "The situation of a woman as a painter in New York at my age is not easy to handle." The Cedar Bar and the club are run by cliques, and only young and pretty girls are wanted round. It's a rat race and a racket of the worst sort. Shortly after moving to New York, Wilson recounted a conversation she had with Clement Greenberg at a party. Greenberg, she said, thought I was in a most interesting situation as an older woman artist and latecomer to the art scene. Despite this rather backhanded, although possibly flirtatious compliment, there was only 4 years between them, Wilson took Greenberg's words to heart, writing, I must get used to not thinking of myself as old, which Bill made me do. Wilson would report in her letters how she was starting to enjoy life, happy to play the part of the eccentric old lady, a role she'd ham up. And while Wilson often complained that she disliked the attitude of smart aleck New Yorkers, she carefully cultivated relationships with critics and other artists, relying on a mix of candid humour and disarming honesty, as well as readily accepting invitations and opportunities to engage with a younger crowd, playing up her working-class naivety and out-of-town grandma shtick. I'm aware I've allowed myself to slide into anecdote, that place where, as Joel Feynman argued, the literary is knotted to the real, producing a form of theorising which honours the uncanny detail of lived experience. In gerontological terms, the anecdote is the territory of the life review. It's hard not to deal with the life when writing about a figure such as Wilson, whose life at times is more interesting, dare I say it, than the work. Or, put differently, Wilson is an artist whose work is contingent upon the conditions under which it was made. It doesn't stand alone. It was made in conversation with who she was and how she worked and lived. What I think Wilson realised early on was that her currency as an artist rested on her story, that is, on her age, which she put to work formally as well as conceptually in her series of photo-collaged ridiculous portraits. The ridiculous portraits incorporate cut-out photographs of Wilson's face superimposed over that of others. She used as her base material postcards and adverts culled from magazines, alongside photographs and colour plates cut from art books, from Renaissance masters to early 20th century avant-garde. The series was made over a 7 or so year period, so while she may look the same, what we are seeing are images of Wilson incrementally ageing. They're almost never dated, but then the point is not to track her ageing self across the series, quite the opposite. Wilson took more photos than she used, and there are still some sat loose among her papers, not quite discarded then, but perhaps stored for later. Of a different order to her assemblage and relief work, which by and large sought to fit in or make sense within the contemporary art world, the ridiculous portraits sit deliberately across or out of time. They were made as works on paper to be mailed to friends and colleagues. Occasionally she had one turned into a stamp. Wilson began the series the same year she moved to the city in 1966, and it stemmed not just from easy access to photo booths, but a need as much as desire to reinvent herself. It's often said that New York is a city only for the very rich and the very poor, wrote Joan Didion in 1967. It's less often said that New York is also, at least for those of us who came there from somewhere else, a city only for the very young. Later, when Didion once again addressed the problem of ageing, she reports responding tartly to her doctor's complaint that she had made an inadequate adjustment to ageing, by pointing out, on the contrary, she had made no adjustment whatsoever to ageing. By contrast, Wilson, neither very rich, very poor, or very young, made plenty of adjustments to ageing once she arrived in New York from elsewhere, tackling the topic both directly and also, and most potently, abstractly, in her ridiculous portraits. Wilson said that her sense of self was in a state of collapse when she moved to New York, and I think it was with these self-portraits she set about trying to rebuild a new one. I want to say I don't think the ridiculous portraits enabled such a rebuilding of self, nor are they straightforward analogues for Wilson's personal experiences. But the fact Wilson embarked upon their making the same year she moved to the city says something about the idea of new starts and selves, about new narratives taking shape, a creative life review in progress perhaps. They follow neither chronology nor any kind of discernible order. Wilson toggles back and forth between young and old, sometimes male, mostly female figures, her head erupting and interrupting the scenario by a series of rude, ignoble and funny facial expressions. To make the portraits, Wilson would visit photo booths on 42nd Street with a pocket full of change. For each flash of the automated camera, she would pull a new face, running through her repertoire as she mugged away for dear life, cigarette clamped between her teeth, cross-eyed, tongue lolling, eyes wide in mock shock, lips pursed in prudery, eyes drooped in grumpy boredom. I'm showing you two stills here from a short film made about Wilson in 1970, charting her life in the city, which documents her visits to the photo booths. Wilson clearly thought carefully about which photographed expression to use in each case, often picking one wittily because wildly at odds with the scene depicted. For instance, in the series where she replaces her head for that of the Countess Daru. This is an unusual group for its use of the same image over again, the portraits registering as both same and different, with the Countess's rosy-cheeked smile swapped out for Wilson's puckering pouts and grimaces. In others, Wilson poses as a young model for a bra advert. Here, a prurient old white man in a family portrait, hair scraped flat and back, and as Marilyn Monroe being fussed over in a mirror. She takes on known figures and inanimate objects alike. Here she is as a bored Queen of England and a nonplussed Statue of Liberty. Here she is as a fisherwoman in Winslow Homer's A Light on the Sea, the hardy, proud stance of the original substituted with a rather more vaudeville gesture of so what. Here she is again, disrupting the orientalising fantasies of Gauguin and Matisse, substituting the faces of the young models with her own grimace of disgust, and in the case of the Matisse, a crinkle-eyed smile. You weren't expecting me, seems to be the message. In this postcard reproduction of Alfred Stevens' Memories and Regrets, Wilson mimes the expression of the original sad, sighing sitter, eyes cast down as though in despair at the contents of the letter held in her hand, across which Wilson has scrawled the word rent in red. It's a sharp updating of what else vexes women, replacing the romantic reverie of the younger woman with the pressing concerns of an older woman with bills to pay. This ridiculous portrait uses a postcard from MoMA of Robert Doisneau's photograph Un Regard Oblique, a series of candid camera-style photographs of members of the public happening upon two works of art in a window. Wilson hijacks that gaze, literally cutting the male viewer out of the frame. The tables are turned, and it's Wilson who goggles at the painting hidden from our view, presumably a more shocking image than the boudoir painting to the left that Doisneau's male viewer surreptitiously ogles in the original. And so what I enjoy about this particular ridiculous portrait is how neatly Wilson preempts the subsequent terrain of rich, brilliant feminist and psychoanalytic theorizations of this image. That playful image of an older woman in the frame doing all that heavy lifting in one fell swoop. Other forms of self-imaging were afoot. Here she is in another guise, dressed as a nun, two trails of cigarette smoke blasting from her nose like a dragon, a pun perhaps on the idea of the bad habit. We meet her as a nun several times. Another photograph, taken the same year, a portrait of a portrait, reveals a 64-year-old Wilson holding a black and white image of her 30-year-old self propped on her lap. The present-day Wilson sports an expression we recognise from the ridiculous portraits, wry, comical, lowered head and raised eyes in knowing complicity with the viewer? Is she inviting us to join her in recognition of the physical gap between her earlier naked self and now? Is this a proposition, perhaps, about the erotics of ageing? She had a whole sideline in collages made from cut-up pornographic magazines. Or perhaps she's emphasising continuity between these two temporally divided images of herself, what Roland Barthes described as that new space-time category of the photograph, as an illogical conjunction between the here-now and the there-then. Wilson reports how as early as 1958 she'd been experimenting with photography, layering multiple negatives rather than her later, more rough-and-ready cut-and-paste technique. In one experiment, she says she transposed her head onto that of herself as a baby, and one of herself as a baby onto her then 58-year-old self. Talk about depressing, she wrote. The old one is a child, and the young one is an old woman. Confusing. Age studies scholar Margaret Morgenroth-Goulet has called this self-aware encounter with one's younger or former self critical age autobiography, that is, the story of the relationship between at least two temporal selves. The word critical is important here. It's a marker alerting us to the strategic use value of autobiography, not as fact or given, but as a method for studying the connection between selfhood and what Goulet calls the life course imaginaries we each inhabit, organised according to a series of predetermined master narratives. Admitting we start with ready-made stories, Goulet writes, how does our ageing narrative work for or against us? Because, as Goulet points out, however much we think ourselves following our own course, in fact all lives are marked by a series of internalised and socially and culturally determined age-related changes that run in chronological order from buoyant youth to decrepitude. Goulet calls this being aged by culture, and these decline narratives are both insidious, invented, and unhelpful. Elsewhere, gerontologists have dubbed this a form of midlife discontinuity. As Wilson time travels with the ridiculous portrait series, she resists linear chronology to occupy a series of temporal selves. But unlike critical age autobiography, I don't think Wilson's ridiculous portraits offer either a salve to the ageing process or a flat-out refusal of it. This portrait by Wilson does something slightly different to the others, in that it seeks affinity and not radical or ridiculous difference from the subject she ostensibly replaces. It's based on the famous painting Whistler's Mother. We might call it, after Goulet, a ready-made story, one that's typically assumed to be about motherhood, in which the artist's mother sits solemn and self-contained on a hard wooden chair, her feet resting on a low stool. Wilson was about the same age as Anna Whistler, both women, surprisingly to our contemporary eyes, only in their 60s, and sports an identical neutral expression, as though carefully miming that of the original sitter. It's a rare one-off where Wilson is in profile, suggesting it was made especially and not taken from her stock of expressions. She'd have sat in the photo booth, sideways on the stool, the original painting in mind, postcard perhaps in hand. Unusual care has been taken to smooth and render invisible the join between the cut and paste, blurring these two temporal selves into one and the almost the same thing, blank signifiers of old age. The painting's proper title is Arrangement in Grey and Black No. 1, although it's almost never referred to as that. Whistler famously insisted on the purely formal compositional elements of his painting. Take the picture of my mother, exhibited at the Royal Academy as an arrangement in grey and black, Whistler said. Now that is what it is. To me it's interesting as a picture of my mother, but what can or ought the public to care about the identity of the portrait? By using the figure of his mother, so familiar and known to him as to serve as a kind of empty canvas, Mrs. Whistler became a placeholder around which to experiment and organise his palette and think through form. What Whistler offers with this painting of his mother is an image of ageing as abstraction, or put otherwise, Whistler's arrangement in grey and black, number 1, is an abstract painting of ageing. Of all realities, Proust wrote, old age is perhaps the one of which we retain a purely abstract notion for the longest time, and the one we have the hardest of times giving shape to as a concept and reality. Simone de Beauvoir agreed with Proust's equation of ageing and abstraction in her 1970 book, The Coming of Age. Although a non-fiction sociology text, it's been suggested that The Coming of Age is best read alongside de Beauvoir's memoirs and autobiographical fiction, which is to say, askance. For de Beauvoir, ageing meant ageing badly, and the book is a pretty depressing read. As she ages, the older woman becomes, we learn, invisible, ugly, undesirable, an abstract idea. What is to me most notable in the book is the anger that vibrates from its pages, a barely suppressed rage that de Beauvoir experimented with earlier in her 1967 trio of short stories titled The Woman Destroyed, in which we meet 3 women at different stages in their lives. I've come to think of these as de Beauvoir's own series of ridiculous portraits, each a critical age autobiography through which she narrates a series of different selves, not reducible to Simone de Beauvoir, but which nonetheless ventriloquize what she called the scandalous attitude toward old age she was then both experiencing and researching. De Beauvoir's tone recalls Jacqueline Rose's description of a scandalous feminism that embraces and takes seriously the darkness and failings, the emotional, psychically charged experiences of women. This feminism that may not always call itself by that name, and it's important precisely because of its refusal to conform, to be reasonable and sane. One of the trio of stories of the ridiculous portraits, Monologue, recounts an old unnamed woman's foul-mouthed and rambling fury at the young people holding a New Year's Eve party in the apartment upstairs. This is a woman for whom ageing badly is a right and curse. Letting rip with a string of screamed and desperately exclaimed expletives, the older woman rails against both her loneliness and her neighbours. It's an unflinching narrative and an unsettling instance of what can happen when an old woman is given voice and visibility, and a warning against what might be said. As I move towards my conclusion, I want to introduce another ridiculous portrait of sorts that offers perhaps more of a resolution that is perhaps lacking in Wilson's work, insisting where she only gestures on that notion of ageing as abstraction. In the last 2 years of her life, the artist Helena Schäfbeck made approximately 20 self-portraits. She was in her early 80s. In her penultimate self-portrait with red spot, the artist added a small red patch of paint just below the dark chasm of the mouth, open as though mid-yawn or yell. It's a jarring late addition to the canvas, recalling that other famous red spot by Turner, who on varnishing day at the Royal Academy added a last-minute scarlet daub to this seascape. Turner's audacity and that spot's abstraction baffled his peers. "He's been here and fired a gun," complained John Constable. Schäfbeck's aberrant red spot in this, her most frequently remarked-upon portrait, is just as attention-grabbing, but its presence threatens only herself, only her image of herself. Turner quickly retorted that his red smudge was, in fact, a boy. Schäfbeck, by contrast, does not stand for anything except a kind of radical abstraction, staking its claim over the canvas as a mark of resistance to representation, perhaps to old age, firmly shutting us, and so interpretation, out. For me, this irrelevant, irreverent red spot speaks to the intractability of any self-portrait of ageing, more so than any number of images of wrinkled, ageing bodies and flesh could hope to muster. It's an eruption every bit as disruptive as that of Wilson's bit part in the story of the shooting of Andy Warhol, or Lasnig's two guns. But I don't want this to sound like a cop-out, that ageing is simply too complex or too abstract a concept to pin down or otherwise articulate visually or with words. But I do think Wilson, like Lasnig, has something different, something quite different, as Eleanor Partridge put it, to say with these works that, like Scherfbeck's Arresting Red Spot, hold our attention, forcing us to come at the subject askance. The history of art is filled with images of ageing bodies that function variously as allegorical, metaphorical, abstract, and realist depictions of times passing. Wilson's ridiculous portraits tell us that, if nothing else. And yet, despite art historical thinking about the body as a site of power, sexuality, and difference, as a register of time, ageing has remained an unspoken and underexplored vector in the discipline, except at the level of subject matter or representation. What happens when we think about abstraction and ageing together? When we think repetition through the lens of rambling, or material change as theoretical problem? Perhaps, and this is my closing gambit, the question of age is one that art history might be uniquely placed to address. In the realm of self-portraiture, the body is the biggest tell when it comes to ageing. Wilson's ridiculous portraits, ridiculous because improbable, absurd and preposterous, know and state this fact boldly. What I think Lasnig, Wilson and others grasped, and what gerontologists and art historians have perhaps ultimately struggled with, is the concept of ageing as a productive, provocative abstraction to think with, not a problem for representation to resolve. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joe. And I embodied everything that Brian talked about beforehand in terms of its range and brilliance and interest and ability to suddenly find such a crowded field and suddenly see that particular area and how exciting that might be to think about that area in further detail. I can't wait to see you elaborate on this theme. So thanks so much, everyone. We've got now a chance to celebrate Joe and to enjoy some conversation and some response to the talk at our research forum, just down the corridor where we've got some drinks to serve. And I'd like to invite all of you to come and join us in the research forum and bathe or enjoy the after effects of the aftermath of this wonderful talk. So before we go, can I ask one more time, a quick last round of applause.